disagree with you and I on that, and I suppose to an extent their will out.
So another aspect of this is that the Parliament's going to close during the referendum period. For me, that's just an entirely sensible policy. It's the most important decision that our country has had. We've heard this a million times. It's the most important thing we've had in 300 years. It's a moment of great import. Sure, they should have a little recess to get on with it. And the way that some of the Labour MSPs and other people have reacted has shown, again, something I thought that we'd gotten past. I thought we'd got over the kind of disdain towards the whole process that was going on, and it's just the SNP's little referendum. But no, all of that stuff came out again this week when the decision was announced, and it was someone said it's the SNP using their majority to bully the rest of the Parliament. And no, they're using their majority to pass their laws. That's what every single government in the world does. But I find the reaction of some people towards this a little bit disappointing. I don't know what you thought of it.
Yes, well, it feeds into an existing narrative which the Labour Party have been at pains through Joanne Lamont and others to promote, which is that your bread and butter issues have been neglected by the Scottish Government, which abandons its day-to-day business to fixate on the constitutional question. That's their argument anyway. I would tend to share your view. I think it's interesting, though. You often think, in terms of why you have a parliament, that it's going to be a crucible for public debate. One might hope, in an optimal world. It's going to be the place where important conversations are had. And this is a sort of a declaration, I suppose, that is not really the case, that it's going to be all across the country, that it's every tribune on their own patch, if you like, everybody campaigning in their own community. And on one level, that's quite a good thing, I think. I think the idea that it's all of Scotland deliberating is a good thing. But it's quite interesting, too, that it sort of says, well, Holyrood's just not the place where these important conversations are going to happen.
But then the idea of the business of government must stop that was another thing that someone said. No, I mean, do we really believe that the Parliament are, is First Minister's questions where the business of government really happens? Or is it that it happens in the Scottish Government Civil Service building? Is that not where the business of government generally goes on, and the Parliament's more for show, a bit of a talking shop in a certain sense? I'm not sure. Where do you think the business of government goes on?
Yeah, well, definitely not in First Minister's question time. Otherwise, I'll weep into my porridge. No, I think that is a performative thing, isn't it? It's about the sort of the public projection of what the government's about. But it happens all across the world. We're talking about on the Enlightenment theme that we've been pursuing. I seem to remember Thomas Paine had an argument about the French royalty, about the crown, effectively, and the fact that you're making a mistake intellectually if you think that it's just the chubby Louis Capet on the crown. It's the crown is loads of people that kind of filter through the tendrils throughout all different pockets and corners of, in his case, the French state. The same is true about government in this country. The idea that it's all being directed by the single sovereign sway from St Andrew's House by Alex Salmond is just absurd. We have such a complex state now with all of these factors and folk involved in it. Yeah, it's just a fantasy that the state amounts to what goes on in Holyrood.
Yeah.
But the idea that what we really need to drive political reform or change is a single inspirational leader is, I think, ridiculous, and bears very little resemblance to the state as we actually encounter it, and power, social authority as we actually feel it and battle against it sometimes. Yeah, and I think that's a lesson we can see in the somewhat uninspiring, inspirational presidency of Mr. Barack Obama. I think it should be a lesson to folk in the limits of a lonely orator.
Oh, well, if I can steal a joke here, now that we're onto this American theme. If con is the opposite of pro, is Congress the opposite of progress? Or did I just blow your fucking mind? I love that, sorry. But yeah, this is interesting because our second topic this week was the gay marriage thing, which is coming up again, and something in America came up about it as well. So maybe we could get back to Scotland via America this time, I think. Andrew, would you like to fill us in on that a bit?
Sure, well, two things this week on this particular issue. Firstly, the Scottish Government introduced its same-sex marriage bill to the Scottish Parliament just before the recess, which is a good thing, I think, and will pave the way towards same-sex marriage being rendered legal in Scotland, and also the ability for civil partnerships to happen in kind of religious settings, which I think is also a good thing. But the other thing on the other side of the channel, not the channel, the Atlantic, you God, this week, the US Supreme Court handed down a judgment in United States against Windsor, which was a case about something called the defense of... No, unless she was in a civil partnership and didn't tell Philip. No, but no, she was. So it was a case about something called the Defence of Marriage Act that Congress had passed and Bill Clinton signed into law, and it basically said that federally in the American system, same-sex married people in New York and the other states in America that allow same-sex marriage, those marriages wouldn't be recognised as marriages for federal purposes, which meant you couldn't have access to certain kinds of benefits. But it also had sort of meant that if you had military personnel being killed, that their spouse were not considered next of kin if they were a same-sex spouse. Basically, the US Supreme Court, in a judgment of Anthony Kennedy, he's called, said this was unconstitutional and was incompatible with the equal sort of protection clause of, I think it is, the Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution. And what I think was really interesting about this was, when I take an interest in it because I'm interested in that kind of litigation, I'm interested in institutions like the US Supreme Court, and I suppose I'm interested in the issue of same-sex marriage. But if you went on Twitter when the judgment was about to be handed down by the very politicized US Supreme Court. It was alive. It wasn't just my American friends on sort of Facebook and things that were keeping an eye on it. That it seemed as if everybody with an interest in the politics of this was sort of rejoicing in DOMA, as it's often called, being struck down by the US court. And I think that's really interesting because it gestures towards the fact that of all of our political struggles on the go at the moment, the one about same-sex marriage is one which is globalized, I would argue, and that there is this interest facilitated through the internet and the accessibility of things like Supreme Court judgments and whatever, and they kind of draw mutual strength from each other and inspiration, and it is sort of represented as part of the same sort of struggle, and I think that's actually quite an interesting thing.
So is it that people just don't want to seem like they're being, bigoted, for want of a better word?
Maybe. I think it's maybe underneath that question is another assumption or a point, which is that the interest of America and the American states is one of sort of comparative perspective, isn't it? It's like, if they do this in New York, why aren't we doing it? Or from the other side of thing, if they do that in Scotland or in Canada or in South Africa, then why aren't we doing it? What arguments do we have? If it's progressive and sensible there, then why don't we pursue a similar policy? So I think that comparative perspective is one you see coming up quite a lot in politics, sometimes. And I think, yeah, it's definitely a sense about where the mainstream of international people that you compare yourself to, where opinion there is at, I think can have an influence domestically. If you want to be seen like a progressive beacon, for example, which is the phrase that Nicola Sturgeon was using, to be up front on these kind of struggles is to lay claim to a kind of image of yourself as one of the more progressive political forces in the world.
Well, on the actual issue itself, I've not really got that much more to say. I think they should just get on with it.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I think, just get it done. And it shouldn't take terribly long. I don't know if people will be getting married before the referendum in 2014, but Holyrood's legislative procedures aren't terribly cumbersome, and it really shouldn't take more than a few months to get this on the statute book after Holyrood comes back. Probably early 2014, I'd guess. And
I don't think this issue is something that really dominates the discussions of politics in the pubs or wherever they go on. But I don't think it's something that is really that important to the majority of people. I understand. I don't mean to be insensitive. I mean, I know it's very important for a lot of people, but I don't get the feeling that there's too many people vehemently opposed to it. Certain church groups, a lot of people might even say, isn't that happening already? There is a small group of people that are definitely vehemently opposed to it, but I don't think by any means that's the majority of the population.
Yeah, probably not. I mean, I'd be cautious about laying claims to know what goes through most folks' mind, but I would have thought not, maybe. But I think the people who it is important for, on which side of the debate they may fall, this is a really big issue. And I wrote something this week about being emotionally radicalized for same-sex marriage. I already supported it, but I was sort of felt more emotionally pulled into it, more sort of fiery and passionate about it by a few sort of experiences with some friends of mine. Some of them getting married, another one of my friends who is in a sort of same-sex relationship who was taking an uncharacteristic interest in the politics around this and being quite affected by some of the madder forms of opposition that one heard from the House of Lords. And so I feel more passionate about it now than I did at the beginning, I think. It feels more fundamental.
And this brings up an interesting point. So, emotion. And let's look at it. Okay, we've talked about it a bit in this context, but let's look at it in the context of the Scottish independence referendum, and then we can broaden it. Should we be voting with our hearts or with our head? Do we make our political choices based on emotions? Do we make them based on the practicalities? Or is it? It's a complicated mix, but the critical word in the question is should.
I think it's really interesting, and it was a point which was made by a commenter on my blog about this, about, well, what is the role, what ought it to be the role of emotion in politics? What is it to say that I feel this to be important? Is that an argument? Is that more of an argument than saying, well, I believe in X, Y, or Z, but I don't feel very passionate about it one way or the other? I think it's very interesting because it reflects wider forms of thought in our society about, well, what is the nature of this kind of personal feeling? And we go back to our 18th century and thinking about romanticism and the ideas of sort of the spontaneous emergent emotion from the individual, and that being a kind of claim to be very much valorized, whether politically or in just your personal life, your emotional life. I think it's really challenging. I find for myself that my emotions aren't always to be trusted. That it's important to think about, well, why am I responding to a particular person, a particular policy, a particular event, or whatever in my life in an emotional way, and should I really trust that? Should I follow my jealousy or my whatever? And I think we've had a very crude argument about this in terms of the independence referendum. Usually it's dreary middle-aged men, I find, who say, well, speaking as a rational person, I think it's terribly important that we bracket all of our feeling sensibilities and simply decide on the basis of projected oil revenues and economic data. And you think, I just find that the idea that doesn't have passion in it, it doesn't have its own passionate attachments to one thing and the other, seems to me very unconvincing. So I think I always find this binary between the heart and the head to be not very helpful, because I've never yet encountered any intellectual person who wasn't profoundly passionate often about many of their ideas, or emotional responses which didn't have quite a lot of ideological content. I'm not sure that I can see it as a useful distinction. It's just a way of saying your opponent's claims are invalid because they approach it with too much sensibility and feeling, I think. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, just to unpack that a bit, like if you were hinting at this, but if you look at a set of statistics that are cold and rational, and therefore the way seems quite clear, the information gives you a very clear idea about what needs to be done, then you will become a passionate supporter of the idea that those facts would suggest. It's not simply that if you are emotional about something, you haven't thought about it. There can be a kind of gut reaction sometimes, but that's different from being passionate about something as well. There's gut reaction is another thing entirely.
And I think I'm trying to remember the phrase. It's sort of a Latin phrase about, it's like the libido scientii, which is about the passion of science. And I have several scientist friends, and you see them with the kind of passionate attachment to their ideas and their investigations. It's anything but cool deductive reason operating in a kind of arid and cold atmosphere of deliberate. It's not like that. That's not how life works. It's a mixture of both, as it ought to be.
Is there a danger that it comes in with something like religion, where people say, like if we disagree about something or some political thing on this podcast or elsewhere, we can argue about it, and it's no problem to not necessarily argue, but we can have a discussion, whether it's heated or not. But then there's certain kind of things that are ring fenced, which is religion. That's his religious belief. You cannot pull him up about that. You cannot say something about that, and which is a kind of strange position that religion is held in. But if we start to move this towards politics, is that not quite a dangerous idea? Oh well, that's his heartfelt belief. You can't bring that up with him. Although that doesn't tend to happen as much. But is there a danger that we could?
Yeah, I think it does actually. I would argue that it does happen quite a lot. I really feel this. You can't criticize me. You can't have a comment on that because I'm just honestly holding this opinion. I mean, we saw that actually the other week about the same-sex marriage debate because one of the deputy presiding officers, Elaine Smith, who's a Labour Party MSP, said that she was going to vote against same-sex marriage on the basis of her constituents' feelings, she argued. And the next day it was all sort of